This presentation is brought to you by the University of New Mexico, New Mexico State Library, and the Space Museum. If you have not been to the Space Museum, please go. It is amazing. And the State Library and the Space Museum are both under the Department of Cultural Affairs. So thank you, everyone, for being part of this program today. So first, I'll go ahead and give an introduction for Professor Jones. Lawrence Jones is a former New Jersey Superior Court judge who served as the president of the New Jersey Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. He's authored over 60 judicial opinions on novel issues of the law, and he presently resides in New Mexico, where he serves as the University of New Mexico's pre-law advisor and visiting lecturer on constitutional law and other legal subjects at UNM. He has also been appointed by the New Mexico Supreme Court as the vice chair of the New Mexico Statewide Commission on Alternative Dispute Resolution. And he will be starting us off with a discussion of the history of the Roswell incident. And I will go ahead and share that now.
First of all, I want to thank the State Library System, the Museum of Space History, the Department of Cultural Affairs for generously hosting this particular program from an educational standpoint. I have four students here who are sensational students. They studied the Roswell incident and what as part of constitutional law studies. And what is really unique, we believe, about this particular program is so much has been written about Roswell in terms of the issue of, is there life beyond Earth? Is there extraterrestrial life out there? And that's always the theme of these types of studies of Roswell. The focus of today's program is really not that. That's the backdrop. But really, it's about constitutional issues and legal issues which arise from the testimonials of those who lived at Roswell during the time of the 1947 incident. And if, in fact, witness accounts are true, as it says in the on that first PowerPoint slide, then what would that mean from a constitutional standpoint? And of course, if something like Roswell 1947 was to happen again, what would be some of the constitutional and legal issues which would be involved in 2026? So we have a tremendous panel here today. Before I introduce them, though, I just want to indicate just a little bit about what happened in Roswell for those who might not be familiar with the story. And if we could just go to slide 2 for a minute, I'd appreciate that. Now, this is an actual photograph of the Roswell Daily Record from 1947. And it says RAAF, which stands for the Roswell Army Airfield. That's kind of the precursor to the Air Force, captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. This article came about as a result of an official press release generated from the United States Army. This was not something that was just, posted by some newspaper. This actually came as the source from the military itself. And this is what kind of set off an international interest in what was happening in Roswell, because as it says on the right, military press release, for the first time ever, the U.S. Armed Forces publicly confirmed the, quote, capture of a flying saucer, what they called then a flying disc, and news immediately traveled worldwide. Our student panelists will be talking more about that. And then the story ultimately was basically superseded by another story, which was put out by the military the next day, saying it really wasn't a flying saucer. And we'll be talking today about what happened over the course of the years and decades after 1947, which generated such interest to this day, and what happened or possibly happened in Roswell and all the different theories about that. But again, a lot of what the students had focused on is kind of reviewing some of the videotapes of those who testified about Roswell or offered testimonials about Roswell. And I just want to show for everybody three specific ones. The first one would be from someone named Major Jesse Marcel. And if we could go to slide 3, please. And before we started, I just want to talk a little bit about it. We're going to just watch a 3-minute video here. And this was in 1978. Major Marcel was a major who was really in charge of a lot of the secret military operations at the Roswell Force. And he was the one who, on the day after the report, put out by the military about the flying saucer basically said it wasn't a flying saucer. It was essentially a weather balloon. And he indicated that that was basically on the direction of his superiors. Then in 1978, he comes forward and indicates, he's retired at this point, that that was really essentially not exactly what happened. So if we can play this 3 minute and 35-minute video, appreciate that. Okay.
The next day, reporters heard that the Air Force had found fragments of the mystery object crashed on a remote ranch northwest of Roswell. Excitement ran high until officials announced it was only a weather balloon. Major Jesse Marcel, in charge of the operation, now tells a far different story.
They took pictures, of course. They had a whole flock of microphones there. They wanted me they wanted some comments from me, but I wasn't at liberty to do that. So all I could do is keep my mouth shut. And General Ramey is the one who discussed, told the newspapers, the newsmen, what it was and to forget about it. It was nothing more than a weather observation balloon. Of course, which we both knew differently.
Major Marcel had to keep silent because of his strategic position at that time. He was in charge of all security and intelligence on atomic tests in the United States and the Pacific. Marcel retraced his secret recovery operation across the hot New Mexico desert.
We left Roswell perhaps around 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. As you can see, it's flat. It is very difficult. In fact, with just verbal directions, we never would have found it. We had to follow the rancher out there.
The crash site was so remote, it took an entire day to drive there.
The following morning, we went out to the site where the crash was. And what I saw, I couldn't believe there was so much of it. It was scattered over such a vast area. So we proceeded to pick up as much of the debris as we could, loaded in a wagon. We filled that up. It took us a good part of the day to do that, because there were such small fragments that we had to do a lot of picking. We found a piece of metal about a 1.5 to 2 feet wide and about 2 or 3 feet long. Felt like you had nothing in your hands. It wasn't any thicker than the foil out of a pack of cigarettes. But the thing about that got me is that you couldn't even bend it, you couldn't dead it. Even with a sledgehammer would bounce off of it. So I knew that I had never seen anything like that before. And as of now, I don't know what it was.
What did crash in this desert? A UFO? A weather balloon? A radar reflecting kite?
It was not anything from this earth that I'm quite sure of. Because I was, being an intelligence officer, I was familiar with just about all materials used in aircraft and our air travel. This is nothing like that. It could not be. It could not have been.
Okay. All right. Now we can go, we're going to go to a second video, which is on the next slide, please. And this is basically a very short 1.5 minute interview with Brigadier General Thomas DuBose, who was one of the ones who basically indicated that it was essentially a weather balloon the day after the first report from the military. If we can play that, please.
Fort Worth, Brigadier General Roger, Chief of Staff, Colonel Thomas DuBose, displayed what they said was the material recovered on the Brazel Ranch for news photographers. Ramey said the material was a weather balloon radar target.
It was definitely not a weather balloon, and it was an aircraft. So what it could have been, I wouldn't know. I still don't know.
There's no doubt in your mind, I gather, that the balloon story was a cover story.
Absolutely none. We knew that it was a cover story, and whose idea it was, I haven't the vaguest idea, but we used that in order to assuage the curiosity of the press, because this had gotten out in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Dallas News, and the UPI.
Well, the press release from Roswell, Blanchard's press release.
Yeah, there are all these pictures from Roswell. You see, all this created a lot of hubbub, and 8th Air Force headquarters had to be the guy that they're going to ask. The president, somebody along the line is going to say, who's running this show? And it comes up to the 8th Air Force, Rainey or the chief of staff. Somebody in there has got to know something about it.
Bill Bragg.
Okay, now if we could go to slide 7, but before we actually play slide 7, I just want to spend a minute kind of giving some backdrop of this to everybody. That's slide 5, so we don't want that one. We'll go to the next slide, it's slide 6, and then the next one is slide 7. If we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, but don't play it yet, please. Thank you. Okay, so basically, during the course of the constitutional law class where these students studied the Roswell incident, and again, the point of the class was not in any way to determine whether there is life outside of Earth or not. People could have their own views on that and their own theories on that. That really was not the point of the class. But as part of the studies, it was to take a look at some of the interviews from people such as you just saw, Major Marcel and Brigadier General DuBose, and just try to put this information to use relative to constitutional law theories if this was true. If everything they're saying is true, and it's not for us to determine if it's true or not, but these videotape testimonials are out there, so to look at them and say from a hypothetical standpoint, if it is true, what constitutional issues could arise from this, assuming just for the sake of a presentation such as this one, it is all true. So there are multiple different videos that the students watch, including from KGFL radio director Judd Roberts, who testified or basically talked about the fact that they were threatened potentially with a possible loss of license if they talked about anything concerning the crash on the radio. Some of the descendants of the sheriff of Roswell, George Wilcox, talking about their testimonials. And again, this is not to say that it's accurate or inaccurate, but this is what is out there amongst other testimonials. This particular testimonial you're about to see is from someone named Frankie Dwyer Rowe. She was a woman who was 12 years old at the time of the Roswell incident in 1947, and she's interviewed decades later about it, and she was the daughter of a firefighter who was there. And the main purpose of showing this at this particular point is not so much, again, to talk about what could be deemed hearsay as to whether there was or were not aliens, but the issue as to her testimonial concerning a visit from someone she indicates was from the military, telling her essentially to not to talk about this incident and how it impacted her. So if we could go to the first one, which you have up there, if we can hit the audio and video, and if we can listen carefully.
The very first time that I heard about this at all. Okay, Daddy came home from work. They worked shifts of a type that they would be on duty maybe 24 hours or 36 hours and then off 8 or 12, like that. So we hadn't seen him for a time. And he got home that evening and he came in so excited, and I was in the kitchen with Mother. And he asked Mother, he said, I've got something I want to tell everybody. Get everybody in here. And she said, we're cooking supper right now. And he said, well, how long is it going to be? Because I've got to talk to everybody. And it was just my mother and myself and the 3 younger kids at home, and my other sister was working. So we hurried and we got it on the table and called the kids in. And he started telling us that they had gone on a call of what they thought was going to be a plane crash north of Roswell. And he said they got called out to Blackwater Draw. And when they got out there, what they saw was not a plane that was our plane, but he said it was a flying craft from somewhere else. Well, we didn't ask questions, but Mother asked all the questions, and we were just listening, and she started, what do you mean somewhere else? And he said, it's not an airplane. He said, it's not from this world. He said the crash was like the flying saucers that they have talked about, because there have been a few comments on the news about flying saucers. And he said it was one of the flying saucers crashed. And I don't think really Mother believed him at first, and he said, no, I mean it. We went out there early today, which I don't know what time that was, but early to him could have meant they left before dark. And he said when they got there, they could see that there were two bodies that were laying on the ground outside of this craft, and that there was one, what he called little person. And he said there's one little person that was walking around, and he said they were still alive. So she asked him, you know, what did they look like? Did they look like us? And he said they were very small, about the size of a small 10-year-old child. But the head looked like the little insect that we played with or that we saw around our house called Child of the Earth. We all knew what that looked like, so nobody asked any questions on that. We assumed that meant that the head was too large for the body, and it had no hair, and it would have large eyes. We knew that because that's what the Child of the Earth insect looks like. He said they looked quite a bit like us. He said they were a lot smaller than we are. Because when he said a small 10-year-old child, I knew he meant smaller than I was. And I wasn't very big at 12 years old. I was a little small for my age. And he said that the other two were dead and that this one that was alive was very sad. But he emphasized and he kept saying, there's no need for us to be afraid. They're not here to hurt us. And he said, we couldn't help them. And he was more upset over the fact that they couldn't help this little person. And that's something he really felt badly, that he couldn't help this one that was alive. He just said, you could feel the hurt from this little person that was so saddened by the death of the others with him. And apparently they hadn't been there but just a few minutes, and he said the military came up and they made them leave. And so they went back to the fire station, and he said there had not been a grass fire, which would have been their purpose for going. And they thought there could have been if it had been a normal plane crash. I don't think Mother really wanted to believe it at first. And he talked about how could we be so smug to think that we were the only ones that God could create. If he could create this earth, he could create a lot of others too. So that was just a conversation over dinner that night. And then there wasn't too much said about it for the next couple of days. Then I was at the fire station one afternoon because I'd gotten sick. I had to see the doctor, and we only had one vehicle. So I went back to work with Daddy. He came home at noon and picked me up on his lunch. And I had gone to the doctor and was sitting in the kitchen part of the fire station, and I was eating a glass of ice chips. And a state policeman came in, and he yelled at Daddy. He said, "Hey, Dan, come over here." And he said, "Get all the guys. I want to show you guys something." The state policeman reached into his pocket, and he said, "I don't think you guys got to see anything like this the other day." And he pulled his hand out of his pocket, and it was closed up. He opened his hand over the table and dropped a piece of material that, when it hit the table, it was all wadded up when it left his hand, and when it hit the table, it spread out like it was water. And they were asking him, how'd you get by with this? And he said, well, he had helped with some of the pickup of debris, and he had managed to sneak that one piece in his pocket. He said, I don't know how long I'll get to keep this before I get caught. Because he said, everybody they catch, they're taking away whatever they've got.
Okay, now before we start the second video, which we'll start in a second, which continues this interview, I just want to indicate that Obviously, there's been all kinds of theories whether anyone really saw anything, whether they were crash test dummies, whatever they may be. And again, that was not the point of the focus of the student study on this. Really, the main point is what you're about to see, which is Ms. Rowe's testimony or testimonial about what happened relative to somebody coming to her home. Okay, if we can play that one, please.
They knocked on the door, and I answered the door, and Mother was beside me, and he told Mother who he was, and that he wanted to talk to the girl that had been down at the fire station. And so she told him it was me. So he came in. And we started to sit down in the living room, and he said, "No, I want you. Go in there in the dining room." You could see the dining room from the living room there. He told Mother to sit at the end of the table, and he told me to sit at the side. He positioned himself across the table, and he told us to sit down, and he stood. And he said, "I understand you were at the fire station the other day." And I told him, yes, I was. And he started out by saying, "I want you to understand that you were never there." And I didn't understand what he meant, because this was kind of not a way of talking that we were accustomed to. And I said, "Yes, I was there." And he said, "No, you weren't." And I said, "Yeah, I was there." And he had mentioned at first that he wanted to see the one who had seen the piece of material that they had been handling down at the station. And I said, "Yes, I did handle it." And he started emphasizing, "No, you didn't." Well, my mother was pretty strict, and we didn't lie. So I'm insistent that, yes, I saw it, yes, I held it. And he got mad, and the more I insisted I had seen it, he didn't just come out and say, "This is not something you're going to be allowed to talk about." He was trying to get it through my head that I never saw it. And he got louder, and he had one of those, looks like a small baseball bat that hooks on the side of your belt, and he took that out, and he's holding it, and he starts beating his hand. Every time he said something, he would hit that on his hand, and he would say, "I want you to understand, you were never there. You did not see anything. You did not hear a conversation." And he said, "If you can't understand this, there are things that we can do." He asked Mother, he said, "Can she keep a secret?" And Mother said, "Yes." She said, "Just tell her what you want her to do." And he said, "Well, first of all, you've got to understand that if you ever talk about this the rest of your life," he said, "there are things that we can do, and we'll do them now. We can take all of you kids. We will take you either to Orchard Park or to Artesia." Orchard Park was the German POW camp during World War II, and Artesia was the Japanese POW camp. And he said, "But we don't have to do that. We don't even have to let you live." He said, "We'd put you in one, we'd put your parents in the other one, but we don't have to do that." He said, "We could take you out here in the middle of this desert." He said, "No one will ever find your bodies, ever. No one will ever know what happened to you." And so he said, "The only way I'm going to let you stay around or live is if you promise you'll never talk about this the rest of your life." So I told him I wouldn't. But that really was pretty much all that was involved. He was probably there at the house maybe 45 minutes to an hour. Mother sent me into the bedroom, and I don't know what he had to say to her afterwards. One of the other military police that was with him stayed in the backyard with the younger kids so they didn't come in the house while he was there. And I never discussed it again until recently. And I'm sorry, Someday, I will get over it. I haven't yet.
Your mother must have had a hard time explaining to you. Obviously, you were raised to be honest.
She never talked to us about it. Never. It was never mentioned again.
From the time you came walking out of your bedroom?
From the time I went to the bedroom until the day she died, we never mentioned it. There was no conversation.
What about your father?
Never talked to him about it either. I'm sure they must have talked to him down at the station.
You must have gotten a good talking to.
I imagine he did. Excuse me just a moment.
That's okay. That's okay. And do you want a drink or something?
No, I just wish this whole thing would go away. It doesn't go away. And it doesn't get any easier. Because every time that I tell somebody about it, I feel like I'm 12 years old again. I can see the guy standing there with his sunglasses on, and he never took his hat off, and he never took his sunglasses off, beating his hand with that stick and threatening us. And at the time he did it, it was okay. Because we'd been through the war, we understood, and I didn't realize it was intimidation. I had no idea what it was until probably the last 5 years, actually. Because I never talked about it again. I never mentioned it to anybody. When this all came out and my kids found out about it, they were really upset with me. Because I never told them about it. A husband who was very upset with me about it, too, because I never told him about it.
Okay, we can close out the screen share at this point. Thank you very much. By the way, for those in attendance, all of these videos are on YouTube, and lots more. Obviously, you could do your own, viewing them if you want to see more of this. They're all on, as I said, on YouTube. I just want to indicate before we turn this over to the students to discuss their studies. During the course of the class, these are constitutional law students, pre-law students, future lawyers for the most part, logically. And when you are going to be an attorney, some of the things you look at is a person's demeanor, their credibility, things like that. You're never quite sure who is telling the truth or who's not, or maybe a mix of the two. But we had some very robust discussions in class following showing this video about credibility, demeanor, things like that. If they were attorneys, what would they see as issues which strengthen this particular person's testimony or maybe work against it? We won't get into all that today. I do want to indicate that we had a couple of guest speakers in the class. One of them was one of the foremost historians about Roswell and the Roswell incident, Don Schmidt. He's written multiple books about this, and he shared with us something we didn't really know, which was many, many years later, he became very close with Frankie Dwyer before she died. She died fairly recently. Basically the son of the military official who Ms. Rowe was talking about physically came to her home with Ms. Rowe's consent. It was arranged in advance to basically apologize for what had happened, what he believed had happened relative to this particular incident, and she accepted that apology. It's a very interesting backstory to what had occurred. Anyway, at this juncture, what I'm going to do is turn the rest of the program over to our moderators and to the students who I'd like to introduce here as student panelists, our Roswell scholars, as we call them. First, we have Nicole Osborne. Nicole is a rising senior at the University of New Mexico studying political science and interpersonal communications. On campus, Nicole has served as a member of the Student Senate and as the executive director of the Residence Hall Association. Originally from Colorado, Nicole is passionate about the outdoors, and her anticipated graduation date is next year, May of 2027. Thank you, Nicole, for participating. Next, we have Caden Salazar. Caden is from Orange County, California, is a political science and psychology major at the University of New Mexico, and he will be also graduating in the spring of 2027 and will be applying to law school this fall, hoping to start a career in criminal prosecution. Outside of class, he writes almost constantly and can reliably be found at New Mexico United soccer games when the team is playing at home. And go USA Soccer. Tatiana James is with us as well. Tatiana just graduated from the University of New Mexico this past May 2026 with a major in political science and a minor in economics. She currently works full-time in the fitness industry and is planning to apply this fall for entry into law school in 2027. Welcome, Tatiana. And finally, we have Miguel Cerna. Miguel is a recent college graduate at the University of Mexico. He just graduated a few weeks ago. Miguel received his Bachelor's of Arts degree in Political Science and Criminology in the spring semester of 2026. He will be taking a gap year before going to law school to help his community out in his hometown of San Antonio, Texas. Welcome, Miguel. Welcome to all four of you. And at this juncture, I'll take a step back and turn this over to Katie Miles and to Suzanne Carroll, and we can proceed from there. Thank you. And Karen Kincaid Brady from the Space Museum. Sorry about that, Karen.
Right. So we're just going to ask some questions in relation to what you all have studied and what you can teach us about this subject. We're going to start with Nicole. As a pre-law student, how do you think the study of Roswell 1947 is relevant to constitutional law students in 2026?
Thank you, Katie. Happy to be here with you all today. So starting off, obviously, one of the reasons it felt especially relevant at the University of New Mexico is because Roswell is in the state of New Mexico. I think it's something that a lot of us are all familiar with. We're all very familiar with the Roswell incident as a cultural phenomenon. We're all familiar with the alien discussions around the incident. And so I think that really helped with getting our footing in terms of studying the incident and understanding the incident, as many of us had also been to the location. But in general, it also introduced us to the importance of the relationship between the people and government officials. So as we will dive into later in different discussions, the Roswell incident included a lot of questions about the rights of people to know what is occurring on their land and the rights of people once something does occur on that land, and what information they can share amongst each other, they can share with the media, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, those kinds of things, and their constitutional rights. And so when we're looking at the Roswell incident, the big question is whether or not the government had fully overstepped the rights of the people of Roswell, which people had been affected, how they'd been affected, and what rights were violated when that occurred. So that makes it especially relevant. And when we're looking into going into law school, it's really important to understand these constitutional boundaries between the rights of the people and the rights of the government. As we're seeing right now in 2026, we're seeing a lot of questions about the rights of government versus the rights of the people. What can people say or do when they're interacting with government officials? As we saw with the Frankie Rowe interview, we saw that there's a lot of questions about how people are communicating and whether or not government officials can lie when they're communicating with people after incidents occur, and when they're trying to protect national interest. As we'll discuss later, a lot of instances on the governmental side were defended as a national interest concern. They were often stating that it was an issue of protecting some sort of information, whereas when we look at the perspective of the people, they were concerned about how the people had been treated, whether or not people were coerced, whether or not their rights were violated, and what they could do afterwards to try to rectify that. And so at the end of the day, we're looking at state transparency and classified information. How do people access classified information, and what constitutes information that is classified to the extent that the executive or legislative branch of the government, either federal or even in the state, may hide truthful information to the public. And we see nowadays consistent legislative battles regarding classified documentation and when people have the right to view such classified material, or how that material may become declassified eventually. So in general, I think it's very relevant. And not only is it relevant, I think it's really interesting. I think when this was proposed to the students, we all found it very interesting because of the cultural background. And the more that you learn about the legal background of the Roswell incident, the more interesting it became.
I think it sounds interesting. Thank you, Nicole.
So, Candid, I have a question for you. Can you share with us a little bit about the location and the historical context of the town of Roswell?
Yeah, absolutely. So Roswell, and I think there was a map that was shown on one of the previous slides or during one of the videos, and it's a town, pretty reasonably small town, certainly in comparison to Albuquerque, certainly in comparison to LA, where I'm from. and it's located in southeastern New Mexico. And at the time, it was really critical. It was obviously, as we talked about, part of the Roswell Army Airfield. And this event occurred early July in 1947. So this is right after World War II had come to an end. Obviously, historically, World War II ended after the United States dropped 2 nuclear fission bombs on Japan and received their surrender 2 years prior. And still in 1947, the U.S. was the only nuclear power in the world. That obviously wouldn't remain for very long. As a matter of fact, neither would the name of Roswell Army Air Base. It actually changed about 2 weeks after. Well, the process of changing began about 2 weeks after when President Truman signed the National Security Act and started the U.S. Air Force. But at the time, obviously, southern New Mexico had been very, very important in the development of those nuclear weapons. The Manhattan Project with Dr. Oppenheimer and essentially everything that involved nuclear development was based in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Alamogordo, New Mexico, is where the Trinity test happened, which is where we first tested a nuclear weapon. And so that importance had continued into 1947. At the time, Roswell Army Air Base was the home base of the 509th Composite Group of the Army, and then later the 509th Air Wing, which is where the 2 planes, the Boxcar and the Enola Gay, that had dropped the nuclear weapons in Japan, as well as any other nuclear-capable aircraft, were based in. They were all based there at the Roswell Army Air Base. So it was, of all the places, essentially the most important to the United States and the United States Army Air capabilities, and later the U.S. Air Force capabilities. In 1947, while World War II was ended, the U.S. was fresh into a new Cold War with the Soviet Union. And obviously, at this point, the Soviet Union was hoping to develop nuclear weapons, and they later would, about 2 years later. But we were really focused on preventing them from doing that, or detecting if they would do that. And that's important in its own respect. But it was also very crucial that kind of everything that the United States did in terms of nuclear weapons, in terms of those nuclear aspects, was pretty secure, right? Roswell Army Air Base was one of, if not the most secure Army bases located in the mainland United States at that time, right? Which it was very difficult to get into. It was very, very compartmentalized. And as you guys saw with those videos with Major Marcel and the Brigadier General, they were very, very restricted in what they could and what they couldn't say. And so this incident occurring not right next to it, but fairly close to the Roswell Army Air Base was very significant. It was very crucial, given that the United States was the only nuclear power in the world, and that all atomic missions and all that research and all their nuclear testing at the time, they were obviously searching to develop the hydrogen bomb, which they later would. It all occurred at the Roswell Army Air Base, where it occurred right next to it in southern New Mexico. So this was by far and away one of the most crucial areas for this to happen. And obviously the Roswell Air Force Base is no longer the only source of nuclear power. So we have a lot of other sources now, but at the time, and in 1947, that was a big part of the Roswell culture. That was a very big part of the Roswell economy as well. A lot of members of the U.S. Army contributed to the Roswell economy. And it was a big part of just essentially what Roswell was in 1947. And obviously, when people think of Roswell now, they think of aliens. It's very alien focused, right? But at the time, it was very different. And this was very, very important to the state government, the local government, and obviously the federal government. When this happened, it was a very big deal.
So, Tatiana, in follow-up to the introductory comments by Professor Jones, and also as a bit of an overview, can you tell us a bit of what happened on that infamous night of July 2nd, 1947 in Roswell?
Yes, it kind of depends on who you ask, or if you were to go back in time and ask people in Roswell, you would get a little bit of a different story. since this was before television and more immediate based media, our story is a lot based on first person interviews, government reports, and press releases at that time. But well, starting with July 2nd, there was the thunderstorm that we heard a little bit about, but it really only adds to that mystery and lore of Roswell, given that this was without video evidence. But in during that storm, basically, there was the loud crash heard by the local rancher Mac Braswell. He's described as an old-time cowboy and pretty serious by his neighbor Loretta. Um, and according to Mac's son, he goes out to the ranch the next day to look for nearby like moist pasture for his livestock. He finds the debris field in Foster Ranch, describing it as about 3/4 of a mile long, 200 to 300 feet wide, and he starts to go through the debris. Um, but when you really don't have all of the facts, you're relying on these first person interviews or testimonies from their children. This is kind of where things get a little bit more hazy. We may never truly know what happened in terms of, especially in order of exactly everything that happened, but it definitely seems like something definitely fell as there was debris everywhere. And like what Caden was saying about there's just general anxiety after World War II, the atomic bomb creation, and then just general anxiety of sort of what is going on in the sky during that time. But Mac Braswell, the local rancher, is going out and he's looking at the debris and describes it as broken up beyond recognition. He starts going through it and seems to think that it's similar to plastic, but this is before plastic is invented. Light as a feather, thin as a newspaper, very flexible but strong, and that they have these unusual qualities to the material. He later goes to his closest neighbors about 10 miles away, Loretta, and encourages them to go see it. I don't believe they actually go see it, but they take a look at it and they also describe it as not being able to be cut through or burned. Then Mac Braswell, goes to his local sheriff, George Wilcox, who we heard a little bit about before as well. And he's going through to the Air Force. And this is where it kind of starts to leave from this civilian side and the local neighbors who actually are firsthand seeing it to all of the military reports that we start to get later on. And that's when Colonel Butch Blanchard of the Air Force who was stationed at the Army airfield at the time at Roswell. He gets contacted by the local sheriff, George Wilcox, and he goes also to the crash site to investigate it. And Jesse Marcel is also there. He's described as an experienced combat pilot, and he normally was investigating and assessing air accidents in like when it's not wartime, basically. But he goes there and he also is unable to identify what the actual debris is and doesn't seem to believe that it's of an aircraft or missile or weather balloon. These are also from interviews we get later on from him. And similar, Jesse Marcel's son also says in an interview that his father brought home some of that debris and that it contained hieroglyphics, styled writing, and they were violet, purple in color. And then Caden described as well all the things that were going on with Roswell Army Air Force at that time, but they kind of start to take over as it goes into the press releases.
Miguel, after the crash, what was the reaction leading to the historic military press release of July 8th, 1947?
Thank you, Suzanne. So, I mean, one thing we have to understand with the crash in 1947 is that it was a different time than 2026, you know. I mean, now we have like a camera in our pocket at all times. We can record everything. Back then, they didn't have that. Things that they had were, like radio, televisions were around, but they weren't really there. So the access to like news and everything, it was much different than it was today. So when that initial crash happened, not a lot of people had information on what was going on. Not many people did. And there was a lot of secrecy surrounding that crash because, again, there's no immediate news. So people had to wait, like news press and everything. So, and another thing was that nobody in Roswell was able to identify where this debris came from or what the debris was exactly. So with this miscommunication, like no information, people began to fill in the gaps on their own, and rumors began to heavily spread that some were able to observe this material, and this was not like anything they'd ever seen before. Tatiana had mentioned that a lot of some people said that this material couldn't be bent, it couldn't be burned, it just didn't behave like anything that has been seen on Earth. Um, and then some other rumors began to circulate that there were again symbols on this material that were very similar to hieroglyphics. But again, these are all just rumors because the government hadn't released anything official up until that press release. The press release happened and they confirmed that this was a flying saucer. And this is really historic because this is the first time that uh, the government had confirmed that there was an existence of a flying saucer. Not only that, they had confirmed that they had captured one as well. So this was very historic and just this blew everyone's mind at the time. And again, this is 1947. We had just come off a World War, so a lot of people are a little fearful about anything that could, or just tensions were high. So the fact that there was like a flying saucer that worried some people. And then immediately the next day, there was a press release that the government put out, and they said, actually, this wasn't a flying saucer, it was actually a weather balloon. So that also caught people off guard because, the day before, the government confirmed the existence of a flying saucer, and the next day they just said, "Oh, we're just kidding, guys. It's a weather balloon," and that also had sparked some more rumors and everything with some people. And there was contradictory statements that not a lot of people had agreed with. They were a little skeptical about everything.
Tatiana, with all of this back and forth and the retraction and press release, this had to create a quite a stir. So what impact did this event have on popular American culture relative to UFOs?
This is such a great question. Probably my favorite question, because kind of like we've been discussing, this time frame is so strange in terms of like how we would look at it today if it were to happen again today. Um, but it didn't really pick up as a major media story until the 1970s. It wasn't until 1978 when Major Marcel came forward with his interview. So kind of leading up to the 70s, really, it was a lot more localized since, especially with the confusion of the press releases, the conspiracy theories as well, like that we're very familiar with today, they didn't really emerge all at once, like we would kind of expect now with conspiracy theories of today's age, but they really evolved over the decades, shaped a lot by media sensationalism that sort of didn't become popular until television started anyway, sort of around the government secrecy, the witness testimonies that didn't come out until the 70s and 80s, sort of general pop culture that didn't become super popular until most homes had television sets in them and people had a lot more access to media that was just a lot more immediate, basically. Um, and brought like broader cultural paranoia too, especially in the 70s. That's Watergate, Cold War, that kind of thing has really shifted how pop culture and media dealt with government secrecy. I think after World War II in 1947, there's, I think, a lot more protectionism going on with the United States. So it makes more sense that we spent a lot of time kind of being, we don't want to be as harsh on the Air Force. Like, these are our soldiers who just came home from war. I don't really necessarily want to be writing a journal article about how they didn't handle this very well. Versus, I think in the 70s, that was a little bit more friendly to the public and was more well received. But yeah, by then, now that we have like 70s televisions in most homes, and the interviews are being shared more around the country, that's really when it did pick up a lot more. Plus, the rise of science fiction and pop culture in media also kind of helped perpetuate the like little green alien figure that we're more familiar with today. Because I think that we didn't actually hear about the aliens until those witness testimonies came out anyway. So the idea of the aliens wasn't even in most of those the initial press releases. But 1960s, we have television shows like The Twilight Zone, which is actually one of my favorites, probably. The Outer Limits, also in the 60s. And that sort of explored more of those like alien encounter situations, normalizing the idea of UFO cover-ups. 1968, 2001, A Space Odyssey movie by Kubrick, which was obviously massively popular and depicted the alien influence that was going on at that time too, and revisiting the idea of aliens actually coming to Earth and not just staying in space. But by the 1990s, too, we have the government investigation that started from one of New Mexico's representatives in Congress. So it doesn't get released, I think, until the later 1990s, but it lasts for about a year or two. And that's when the Air Force started releasing more of their reports on Project Mogul, a Cold War spy program, and that they're claiming about that. But we can get into that probably later as well. But that kind of public reaction reinvigorated the 90s media that we then saw again, which is, I think, what I'm a little bit more familiar with my generation, which I think was also the popularization, I think, of like everyone wanted to be an astronaut in kindergarten, that kind of thing. But in general, really, since that event, the Roswell incident made a significant impact on modern media that is still seen today. Like if you go to BuzzFeed, YouTube videos, the History Channel in general, at least I grew up watching that late at night. If you're sick and you're stuck watching it, you would see definitely somebody at midnight talking about aliens and conspiracy theories and that kind of cartoon image that you saw. But it definitely, in modern media, especially through YouTube and traditional media on television, continued today. And Roswell still has a very large tourist industry that is alive and well.
I'm going to tag on to that and ask Nicole, from a cultural standpoint, how did the Roswell legend grow?
Yeah, so kind of adding on a little bit to what Tatiana was talking about, I think it's important to note that the alien legend was around before Roswell, but there was a significant spike in UFO sightings before Roswell occurred that was kind of in the cultural viewpoint at that time. So, one of the first things we see about aliens, widely regarded as being from H.G. Wells in 1898, which was the War of Worlds, where he introduces this common idea of a Martian, what a Martian would be like, and what it would be like if they came here, and that they would be trying to invade Earth in some way. Then in 1947, less than a month before the Roswell incident occurred, there was a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold who saw what he described as unidentified flying objects, which were flying at speeds he says were around 1,200 miles per hour, very, very fast. He says that there were a lot of them and that he believed that these must be extraterrestrials and these must be aliens. And so, from many perspectives, people believe that that is why that the people of Roswell would have first thought this must be not from Earth, because it's not something that we immediately think when there is an object on the ground. We don't think, oh, an alien must have brought that here. So there was some mythology that was occurring prior to the Roswell incident that allowed people to think that that could be happening. And then throughout the 40s, through the 70s, and then onwards, we see this interest in aliens and unidentified flying objects and Martians really come about, especially through the popularity of science fiction. And one of the reasons science fiction was so popular in this time is because, as previous panelists have discussed, World War II ends in 1945, and then we essentially get launched into the Cold War by 1947. And then the Cold War sticks around until the early 90s. And so it was high on the mind for a lot of people. A lot of people were fearing so many things. They were fearing their own government, they were fearing other governments. There was a lot of high anxiety. And so it was almost easier to pin things on aliens than it was to try to come up with a potentially more rational or explanation from this earth. Something not from this earth instead was easier for people, and especially the people of Roswell. And I think another aspect that made it so culturally important was the fact that the military had gone back on what they said. And so at this time, with a lot of anxiety, the military can't get their story straight. clearly the military is not going to tell us the truth because the truth is aliens was kind of the route that people were taking. And so after the Roswell incident, there continues to be numerous reported sightings, and clearly the Roswell incident influenced that in some way, shape, or form. Somebody sees a flying star, they don't get a good look at it. Clearly it's a UFO, or it's something in the sky that they can't identify. And so it became a very, very popular term, UFO, flying saucer, flying disc, for things that weren't identifiable. Then in 1968, we see Chariots of the Gods, which is another significant piece of writing related to aliens by Eric von Daniken. I will try to pronounce that correctly. And he developed a framework that there were ancient astronaut aliens that came to Earth. They helped to build the pyramids. They helped to build everything we know in prehistory as being grand or impossible. They influenced human technology and religion and development. And that also goes into this theory that there were hieroglyphs on the fragments from the Roswell incident, connecting that once again to the pyramids. Why would there be hieroglyphs? It's because also the aliens have been to Egypt, right? And so they've had these different interactions throughout the world, and it's not just happening here in Roswell. It must be a global phenomenon at that point. And so, as Tatiana said, it did start by growing amongst the community of Roswell. Roswell was one of many instances of alien interaction, but it definitely started to become more prominent once the television came around. And so looking at aliens on TV shows such as Through the Twilight Show, which was previously mentioned, eventually the Roswell UFO incident would be mentioned several times on Unsolved Mysteries, and they got their own episode in a Netflix revival of the show semi-recently. And there was also a film called Roswell released in 1994, and that's only a small part of the cultural phenomenon and the cultural references that we have today from this incident. And it essentially happened in near perfect timing to occur alongside an existing growth in the interest of aliens. And so it was so difficult for the government at that time to really have any explanation for what had occurred, because the people had already decided that it must have been an unidentified flying object from another world.
Thank you, Nicole. That was a great answer. Very thoughtful.
I have to say, too, aliens are a lot more interesting than a weather balloon.
We'll move on to Tatiana. So let's go ahead and move on to the right of military to retain certain information as state secrets. Are there court cases following 1947 which in retrospect might possibly legally support the government's actions as constitutional?
Yes, there's one in particular. The actual event occurred about a year after Roswell. I think it was 1948. The actual case didn't happen or was decided until a couple years after that. But the United States versus Reynolds case dealt with issues of disclosure of certain information for national security purposes. This case, happened about 3 years after Roswell. It involved flight, military, and how people could discuss state secrets. Very similar to kind of what Frankie is discussing in her testimony as well. But in 1948, there was a military aircraft crash. 3 civilians died, and their spouses brought forward a civil wrongful death lawsuit. The widow's attorneys, they were most interested in trying to get the military accident investigation report disclosed, but the Air Force was claiming that this would threaten national security and that it contained military secrets. The trial court too was sort of in support of the widows as well, saying that they couldn't really decide the case then without having that information disclosed, because how would they know if it was state secrets or not? And the Air Force basically appealed that ruling. That's when it went up to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that the federal government may withhold information from a court on the grounds of national security. So they wouldn't have to disclose it to the widows or to anyone else basically looking for kind of, I guess, what we would think of like Freedom of Information Act now, which wouldn't apply in these situations anyway. But the Supreme Court ruled that that state secret privilege was in power of the executive branch of government, so therefore the military, and it was a privilege against revealing any military secrets, basically kind of without question, and that privilege would apply when there is a reasonable danger that compulsion of the evidence would expose military matters in which the interest of national security would be in danger, basically. And in that, the recognition of that state secret right would be basically in charge of, or the power would be in the military's hands of whether or not they were disclosing it, and they could make that decision basically depending on who was asking. But the kind of interesting question is, would that then apply in Roswell? Some similarities, some distinctions. So same with similar to Project Mogul with the aircraft explanation. If it was a military plane, if it was happening not during wartime, would that still apply? And if it was not on a mission, so since this was right after World War II, if that Project Mogul airplane wasn't on a mission, is that still a military state secret? Is it something else? Since there's so much mystery and lore regarding Roswell and regarding the air base there, kind of brings up a lot of questions. And if it would qualify as a state secret, since this case obviously happened after Roswell, we may never know.
Miguel, does the government or military ever have the right to enforce a citizen's silence on what they consider to be classified material?
It really does depend. So, in short, they might have the right to enforce citizen silence on what they consider to be classified. But one case that stands out to me is SNEP v. United States in 1980. And just based on the precedents of that case, I think that the government might have the ability to silence citizens based on what they find as classified. So in this case, SNEP was an employee of the CIA, and after he retired, he wanted to write a book about the activities that the CIA had done in like Vietnam and other times of war. And before SNEP had decided to go on board to be part of the CIA, he had to sign an agreement. And in this agreement, word for word, it said he was not able to publish any information or material regarding the agency, its activities or intelligence activities generally, either during or after the term of employment without prior approval of the agency. So basically what that means is that if he wanted to create any type of media, whether that be a book, a movie, just anything that relates to his time with the CIA, he had to go through this agency or he had to go through the agency to get it approved in order to make it public. But SNEP did not do that. He just went on his own accord and he just tried to publish the book regardless and without the CIA's approval. But eventually the CIA did get word of the situation, and eventually this is like a huge deal and it gets taken up to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court decision, they decided that SNEP had deliberately breached the contract that he had agreed to, and he had an obligation to keep any secrets that the agency had wanted to keep a secret. So when applying the facts of SNEP to Roswell, it might not line up as well just in general, just because, I mean, SNEP is a particular case, and with Roswell, he, these citizens, they weren't like under contract or anything. These were just citizens they're at the wrong place at the wrong time. And SNEP, on the other hand, he was consented to keep secrets. So it might not line up entirely. So in other words, SNEP agreed to be silenced if he was ever asked to. Citizens of Roswell weren't. So some might argue that the SNEP case might not, or not that it doesn't apply, but the facts don't line up exactly with Roswell.
Thank you. If I could just indicate, I see we have Caden now back. He may have been zapped into an alternate universe while we're talking about this right now, or who knows what it could have been. He could have been taken up by a weather balloon, perhaps. But in any event, we do have Caden back. I know Caden was going to be speaking a little bit about congressional intervention and official reports, and then something further concerning the Frankie Rowe video, which we watched. So if we can double back to Caden at this point, and hopefully we can get caught up.
I'm sorry, would you just like me to start speaking on the question?
Oh, well, I don't think the question's been asked. I know that the moderators were going to ask some questions along those lines, which we skipped over temporarily. So I'm not sure which moderator was going to cover those, but whichever of the three of you it was, if we could proceed and we'll move forward.
So welcome back. What happened with congressional intervention and official reports?
Yeah, so I'd like to first preface this by saying I'm sorry. I have no idea what happened. I guess the aliens must have got me. I could hear everyone talking about how I wasn't replying to the question, but I couldn't get my mic to turn on. Yeah, so for congressional intervention, after Major Marcel's report had come out, there was a lot of attention in the news, and specifically there was attention coming from New Mexico about this thing. So in 1994, led by the United States Congress, this was pioneered by a congressman for New Mexico's first district. So for those of you not familiar, that's right here in Albuquerque. And he's actually who the office I work in now is named after. His name is Steve Schiff. He pioneered this whole effort to get a real report and get some actual answers about what did happen in Roswell in 1947. And this was originally done in the form of a very short audit in 1994 by the Government Accounting Office. And nothing all that interesting came out of that. But fast forward to 3 years later, a much, much longer, I'm talking over 200-page report, was released in 1997 on the whole Roswell incident. And this report attributed everything that happened in Roswell to this top secret program. I believe Tatiana mentioned it earlier, called Project Mogul. And Project Mogul was essentially, it was this top secret project. It was very heavily classified, and it was aimed to release essentially a weather balloon, not really a weather balloon, but essentially release a device into the air, and it was supposed to keep track of radiation levels on Earth, and it was designed for that. If the Soviet Union ever tested a nuclear weapon, we would locate it. Obviously, there's a lot of questions about whether or not this is true, but when this report was released, the Department of Defense was basically just like, yeah, we couldn't in 1947 tell everyone that we were detecting Soviet nuclear weapons.
And if I could just jump in here, if I may, just to being cautious of the time here and a lot of the IT issue, if I could just ask a quick follow-up question to Caden here. One of the issues in Roswell, we listened to Frankie Dwyer Rowe testimonial, is whether the military was surveilling private houses and actions such as, she was only 12 years old, or others at the firehouse, assuming just for the sake of argument that Frankie Dwyer Rowe's testimonial is factually accurate. Constitutionally, what is your view? Did the military have the right to have surveillance of private citizens when there was no charges or findings of probable cause of any type of crime or felony or anything along those lines?
So yeah, that's a great question. It turns out there's actually a very relevant constitutional case that went about in the 60s, a little bit ago, that deals with that exact issue. It's called Laird versus United States. It took place in Detroit, which is really great for me because I'm a Lions fan. But in Detroit, the U.S. Army was called in to assist local law enforcement on multiple occasions. There had been several different riots, several different instances of civil disobedience, mostly owing to unions. Obviously, Detroit was a massive manufacturing city, huge to the U.S. economy in the 1960s. And in these late 60s, as these incidents of civil disobedience tended to become more and more of a trend, the U.S. Army began essentially doing this exact thing. They began collecting information, collecting intelligence on people who were involved, whether or not they were suspected of a crime. They had a list of people who had gone to these protests, people who very well were and very well might have been just exercising their First Amendment rights. And they weren't necessarily charged or suspected of any criminal activity. And they certainly didn't have a warrant from the U.S. military. The U.S. military is not a law enforcement entity. It's not a civilian law enforcement entity. They can enforce military law, but it's very difficult for them to, except for some extreme cases, enforce civilian law, right? And then the people of Detroit argued that the existence of any surveillance in this form, and they sued under this argument, had a chilling effect on the First Amendment rights. And chilling essentially means that the government isn't actually doing anything to prevent you, or they're not explicitly precluding you from exercising your rights, but they're taking an action that would make it seem as if doing that was discouraged. And that chilling effect is a credible concern. It's something the courts have ruled on in the past. And the Supreme Court, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they said that no, that this data gathering doesn't actually show, and I want to take an exact quote here, objective harm or threat of specific future harm against the people exercising their rights here and against the people that the military had been essentially collecting intelligence on. And on the face here, the facts in Laird may support the alleged actions of the military in regard to Frankie Dwyer Rowe, in regard to several of the other people who were involved in the Roswell incident, right? It seems pretty clear, the military can keep track of you, and that's not actually violating your First Amendment rights. However, I do want to draw several key distinctions between the Laird case and Roswell here. Not to say that there's a concrete answer one way or the other, but these are very different incidents with very different actions taken by the U.S. military. The first one, obviously, being that the Army had been called in multiple times in Detroit to help quell civil disobedience, quell these riots. They had several operations in which their security, the security of those soldiers, was directly affected. And that's not the same case. That's not really the same case at all. This was presumably the first and only UFO crash right by a U.S. Army base, or later U.S. Air Force base. And additionally, that's not also the same thing that happened in the Roswell incident. Obviously, if we listen to the testimony of Frankie Dwyer Rowe, what seems to be the case is that the military policeman essentially threatened her, that said that all of these terrible things were going to happen to her if she talked about what she had seen at that fire station. That's not just surveilling or keeping data on people involved in information. That actually does have a much more substantial chilling effect. And I believe, and I can't say for certain, I'm not a Supreme Court justice, but I believe that there would be something considered and the reason I wanted to bring that quote is there is a specific threat of future harm, I think, in that. So I think there's a pretty key distinction between those two cases.
I think what Caden means is he's not a Supreme Court justice yet at this particular time, but we'll travel forward 20 years and we'll see what the situation is then. Katie, if it's all right, if I could just ask one more question before turning it back over to you guys, and I would direct this towards Nicole, trying to keep us on the appropriate time. So Nicole,
I was going to ask Nicole.
Oh, you're going to?
Larry.
No, go
Let me
ahead.
ask Nicole. Okay.
Go ahead, Katie.
I was just so Caden brought up the Laird case, right? It's obviously kind of in support of the government side of this. So if we shift to constitutional arguments in favor of the people, what is the constitutional doctrine of prior restraints, and how does it relate to what allegedly happened in the 1947 Roswell incident?
Thank you, Katie. I'll start with defining a little bit for everyone prior restraints and what that looks like. So prior restraint is government censorship, which seeks to prohibit speech or expression, including press, before it can occur. So that would be trying to tell someone, like in the case of Frankie Dwyer Rowe, not to speak about something, even though she hasn't said anything publicly at that point. In the case of Roswell, there were multiple individuals, which we've spoken about, who the government requested to remain silent about the incident. I use request lightly there. Obviously, Caden talked a little bit about the chilling effect and what it means when government uses coercion against people. But what we define as freedom of speech and freedom of press is to be free from prior restraints and not controlled by the government in those ways, including those working for the federal and state level, depending on the circumstance. Obviously, there are some cases where people are privy to information, and when they gain access to that information, they sign something, whether that be a legal document or something like an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. In this case, Roswell is very unique because there were no signatures prior to people witnessing this and prior to people like Frankie Dwyer Rowe acknowledging what had happened. And so when we're looking at Roswell, we have to look at the different forms of coercion and the various methods which were used to implore witnesses to stay silent. And so a case that comes to mind in regards to freedom of speech and freedom of press here would be New York Times versus United States. This case is from the 70s, 1971 in particular. In this case, the United States tried to stop the New York Times and the Washington Post from publishing classified government documents from the Pentagon, so the case can also be referred to as the Pentagon Papers. The Supreme Court held that the government's urging of security does not trump the newspaper's freedom of press as guaranteed by the First Amendment. And so what we're seeing here between some of the defense of government and some of the defense of people here is that it really depends on a case-to-case basis. But what we're looking for is precedent, and we're looking for analysis of constitutional rights. We're not necessarily looking for things that are 100% equivalent in occurrences. So obviously there was no prior Roswell incident, and we haven't seen something exactly like Roswell following the incident. But what we want to understand is, why did the Supreme Court justices decide in these cases that the people get to maintain their freedom of speech and freedom of press despite the fact that they had access to secret information or information the government wanted to be secret? So the court held that in order to support an issuance of prior restraint, the government needs to prove that the newspaper publication or the speech itself would be inevitable, direct, and immediate danger to the United States as a whole. And so we're not looking at something that would be unfortunate or an annoyance to the government, or now the people are going to harass their own government over what this documentation means. We're looking for, if this documentation were to be released, then we would see a death toll, or we would see large security risks. We would see, things of true concern, not matters of protest. And so one of the reasons why it's so important to understand, especially Frankie Dwyer Rowe in this case, is that they don't have the right to silence people from speaking out against the government, because that doesn't count as inevitable, direct, and immediate danger to the United States. That's a protected right. Whether that falls under protest, freedom of speech, or freedom of the press, all three of those are constitutionally protected, and every individual has the right to that. We're also seeing at this time, Frankie Dwyer Rowe was a minor, and despite being only 12 years old when the incident occurred, she still has the same rights as any other American, even though she had not yet reached the age of 18, and her mother and father, who were both also presumably approached by the government, also maintain their rights.
Tatiana, Frankie Dwyer Rowe's testimonial reflects a position that the government, through the military, may have been attempting to suppress free speech through intimidation and indirect censorship. Are there any U.S. Supreme Court cases which deal with the constitutional issue of government intimidation to suppress exercise of First Amendment constitutional rights through indirect censorship?
Yes, and I'll try to go through this a little bit quickly because I know we're low on time now, but there's one in particular, the Bantam Books versus Sullivan case, which is a pretty landmark First Amendment case when we're dealing with censorship, which is obviously super relevant. But basically, there was a Rhode Island commission that had been started from the Rhode Island state legislature, but they had informal powers. And they were more dealing with like books that they were approving for children and minors. And they had started using their informal powers to send out letters and making them seem very official or formal in to, they weren't allowed to officially ban any books, but they started sending these informal letters that seemed very threatening to publications, to book publications that they had deemed obscene or inappropriate for children. And this obviously ended up at the Supreme Court level, basically asking that question: did this commission, Rhode Island Commission, violate the First Amendment by informally pressuring distributors to remove allegedly obscene materials, even though the commission lacked formal censorship power? And the Supreme Court said that it did violate the First Amendment. So kind of bringing that back to Frankie, that was very similar in terms of informal powers coming as a representative of the state, the military, similar to this state commission that had its powers from the legislative, but kind of using that power informally to threat or coerce individual citizens. And using those tactics, warnings, threat of prosecution, like Frankie said in her testimony, to suppress speech, to have that chilling effect that Caden discussed, and same with the prior restraint issue that Nicole discussed as well, sort of censoring people preemptively before they have even spoken. So that was in this case, sending letters to distributors, newsstands, bookstores, warning them that materials were objectionable, kind of using almost like legal language to make it seem like it was legal or threatening a lawsuit in the future. So it seemed like you're basically informally censoring on these book publications under the assumption that it's basically formal, which kind of is very similar to how Frankie described her interactions with the military personnel that came to her house, and kind of encouraging that voluntary removal or censorship to avoid any future legal troubles, basically, which is what Nicole is discussing as well about the prior restraint issue. So Supreme Court ruled that it was in violation of the First Amendment, and it would be very interesting to kind of see what that case would have looked like in this situation, Roswell. But mostly it applied to press releases and journal articles, that kind of thing, but could definitely be applied perhaps in this case.
I love how you were able to connect someone bullying a 12-year-old to banned books. I think that's a really nice connection. Caden, in considering these cases that have just been cited by your fellow panelists, is there an overarching principle regarding the First Amendment as it relates to content and the subject matter of speech?
There is. That's a great question. And this is going to sound really nerdy, but I'm about to talk about my favorite Supreme Court case. But yeah, so this was fairly recent. There is one piece of legal precedent that I think addresses content basically perfectly. And this was a very recent case, and it's called Reed versus Town of Gilbert. Gilbert is a somewhat small town in Arizona. And in Gilbert, I'll paint the picture a little bit. They had passed the city ordinance that it was basically for every type of content, except for essentially political signs, if you wanted to put a sign up anywhere in Gilbert, Arizona, it couldn't be bigger than a pretty small sign, basically like a yard sign. And it could only be up for so long. You had to come take it down after probably like 12 hours. And it was a very very strict law or ordinance they passed out in Gilbert. And there was this guy, Reed, who had like a weekly church group, and he would put up directional signs that he wanted to keep up for longer to direct people where to go for his church group. And essentially, the city ordinance was like, hey, you can't do that. You have to take them down earlier than you want. And so he sued. He said that was a burden on his constitutional rights. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with him basically unanimously, which is pretty rare in the modern day. But they basically said that, no, you can't do that. And they did. They came to a conclusion that is often cited now. And what they essentially said is that you can't that if the government wants to restrict speech based on the content of that speech, There are two different types of restrictions. The other one is like the time, place, and manner of your speech. It's like yelling out in the library. But if you want to restrict someone on the content of their speech, the government must have a compelling interest in doing so, and whatever action the government's taking has to be as narrowly tailored as possible to meet that government interest, which means they can't go overboard at all. And this is a very overarching theme when it comes to, as Suzanne said, bullying a 12-year-old, or essentially anything that the government did throughout the response to the Roswell incident. Whether or not there is a compelling government interest advanced by telling people not to talk about the Roswell incident, that very well could be true. Or telling people not to talk about aliens, that very well could be the case. But the other key thing, and the thing that they brought up in Reed, and I think is most important here, is the idea that it has to be narrowly tailored. I'm really not sure that there's any way in which them sending a military police officer to a civilian's house and hitting their hand with a baton and then saying that we're going to send you to a POW camp or something even worse to that child. I'm not sure that there's any way that that's really a narrowly tailored interest, or that's a narrowly tailored method to meet that supposedly compelling interest. And I think that while this is a far cry from directional signs to a church group in a small town in Arizona, this is still very relevant. In that case, can be analogized here very, very closely in the fact that what they were trying to do with Miss Rowe, the military was trying to do allegedly with Miss Rowe and with so many other people, was a restriction on their speech based on the content of the speech. They couldn't talk about what they saw in Roswell, and that is very clearly a content-based restriction.
Definitely. And let's continue with this theme of going overboard. Nicole, even in times of war, can the military and government unconstitutionally go too far in the name of national security?
Absolutely. One of the things to think about as we dive into this is that in times of war, the government can act differently than it would without that. And so sometimes you will see presidents make decisions that usually would have to go through Congress in the name of war, or Congress make decisions that they probably wouldn't make usually if they didn't deem it important for national security. And so looking at this, kind of going back to what Caden was talking about a little bit with the prisoner of war threat that was against Frankie Dwyer Rowe, at the time in which Roswell was occurring, there were prisoner of war camps for both Germans living in America and Japanese people living in America, including those who had American citizenship or dual citizenship for those countries. And they were nearby in New Mexico, but they had various locations as well. And so one of the cases that we reference in relation to this is the Korematsu case in 1944, which is Korematsu versus the United States. And so what had occurred is an individual by the last name of Korematsu was refusing to go to one of these prisoner of war camps, and then was, detained and taken by force to one of these camps. And he was convicted additionally of violating the order to go to the camp. So aside from just having to be at the camp, he also faced other charges. And he argued that the executive order, which was made by President Reagan at the time, violated his Fifth Amendment, which the order was Executive Order 9066. And the Supreme Court at that time affirmed Korematsu's conviction. So they agreed that the president had the right to do that, and that Korematsu's conviction was sound at that time. This is in 1944. The conviction would later be appealed, but at that time, the opinion was 6-3. So 6 people agreed that the evacuation order was valid because they said that it did not show racial prejudice, but was responding to the strategic imperative of keeping the U.S. and the West Coast secure from invasion from non-allied forces. So then the court relied on a decision which they had had a year prior, which addressed similar issues regarding these prisoner of war camps that were on American soil. The dissent argued that the marital necessity arising from the danger was not high enough to do this to individuals. And so the reason that we reference this case here is because it did eventually get overturned, and Reagan did eventually apologize for that order. And the reason it got overturned was because it was found to be based on racial prejudice, and it was not a substantial enough need. There was information which was hidden from the American public regarding the danger of Japan, and at this time, the people who were Japanese living in America were not found to be a significant danger. And so while part of it was repealed because of the racial aspect, part of it was also repealed because the amount of danger had been oversold essentially to the American people and to the government themselves. And there was a lot of deceit in terms of what we knew about how this could impact the American people and the safety of our nation. And so looking at this case, we understand that what was occurring in Roswell was not a significant enough threat to national security, whether that be a weather balloon, an unidentified flying object. There was no direct harm to the people. And so following this case and the repealing of the results of this case, we understand that similarly, there was not a high enough national security need to do something to the extent which it was done here. And as we've previously stated, obviously, when we're looking at these Supreme Court cases, we're not trying to connect apples to oranges. They are very, very different in terms of substance. But what we're looking at is the constitutional rights of the people in relation to their government. And what we see is that the government absolutely overstepped boundaries in the past. They continue to overstep boundaries in the Roswell incident. And there have been other Supreme Court cases which have amplified this concern that the government can overstep, especially during wartime, and they often get away with it due to the people's anxiety. And Congress will let the president slide, or vice versa, due to this wartime concern.
If I could just jump in for a second here, I think Nicole had a slip of the tongue on one point. There was a reference talking about the 1944 case, and she referenced President Reagan, and I think you meant President Roosevelt at that time. But
yes,
then,
I did. I apologize.
Yes, but then 40 years later, it was President Reagan who addressed it and apologized for what had happened 40 years earlier, on approximately the 40th anniversary of when all the 1944 case.
Yes, I apologize. I got my R presidents confused.
We all do that.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. Yeah.
So talking some more about the military, Tatiana, let's say hypothetically that the government was trying to keep secret a post-World War II military surveillance project called Project Mogul, and the device they launched into the Roswell area sky malfunctioned and crashed. In such a circumstance, did the government have a right to compel silence? Or did the fact that they shot the item into the sky where it may have been visible constitutionally take away the expectation of privacy and confidentiality?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's is a pretty similar case dealing with, well, not Project Mogul, but a similar case dealing with airspace and the right of privacy going on with airspace, which is a very interesting constitutional question. But the Florida versus Riley case from the 80s was pretty much dealing with specifically the Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, and asking that question if the government does have to obtain a warrant for searches in the air. But in the 1980s, it was 1984, the police received an anonymous tip that suggested that Riley was growing marijuana in a greenhouse in his home, in his backyard in Florida. And the police, without obtaining a warrant, flew a helicopter about 400 feet in the air over his property and were able to, from the air, visibly observe the marijuana plants growing inside the greenhouse. Since they didn't have a warrant, they used what they had seen in pictures, surveillance from that helicopter ride to arrest and convict Riley. And that kind of question came up, which is, does this violate the Fourth Amendment in terms of prohibition on unreasonable searches and seizures? So Riley's lawyers and his argument was basically that this did violate the Fourth Amendment because of kind of like gets into the nitty gritty of the Fourth Amendment, but that his greenhouse was in the curtilage of his property, which is normally considered under the protection of the Fourth Amendment, that you would need to obtain a warrant to go and search it. And that the police kind of intruded on that reasonable expectation of privacy by flying over his house. And that would then require a warrant to see. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, the Supreme Court ruled that the police could do so without a warrant. So it kind of goes into that question of airspace privacy and does it or doesn't not exist. And also going into the plain view doctrine, which the police used also, since they didn't physically intrude onto his private property, that airspace they're claiming is plain view doctrine, which is normally like if a police officer is walking by your car and they can see you smoking marijuana in your car, that would basically be plain view doctrine, which is that they can see it, that they're lawfully present in the area and that they can see that the evidence is immediately apparent. And this kind of goes back to Project Mogul, which is like, this case obviously occurred about 40 years after, but if that was then no longer confidential, kind of if you could flip it on government versus civilian, which is like, if this were reversed and you could see Project Mogul crashing or in the air as a civilian in Roswell at that time, would that then be considered public plain view, basically, and get rid of that reasonable expectation of privacy that they had kind of gotten rid of in terms of airspace during the Florida versus Riley case. There are some distinctions. Obviously, this is a little bit different. There's no drug search with Project Mogul, but things can be seen in the sky, fall apart in the sky, and kind of bringing back to that question too of like state secret doctrine or state secret and the plain view doctrine, which is like, is it a state secret if you can see it and you're just walking outside of your house, similar to the police officer walking by your car? And would airspace, not be considered private then at all if a helicopter can fly over your house in general and see anything going on in your backyard? But basically, Florida versus Riley dealing a lot more with the constitutionally obtained warrants, airspace privacy, the Fourth Amendment, searches and seizures, and the rights of the police officers to do so versus a public citizen in Roswell at that time, perhaps in chance viewing Project Mogul. But it brings up some really interesting questions, I think.
I'd like to take us back to Frankie and Miguel. I'm wondering, so if her testimonial, if that's accurate, it deals with actions by the government through the military to a child. Does this factor raise constitutional concerns as well?
Thank you, Suzanne. So one particular case that comes to mind is Prince v. Massachusetts from 1944, which came 3 years before the crash in Roswell. So if Miss Dwyer Rose's testimony is accurate, there are some constitutional concerns that do come with like scaring children and everything. And in this case with Prince v. Massachusetts, this has to do with like with children's well-being. And in this case, some of the facts were that Prince was a Jehovah's Witness and the primary guardian of her 9-year-old niece. And with Jehovah's Witnesses, at least at this time, she had been she wanted her niece to pass out pamphlets and religious memorabilia, and just possibly getting some donations and things like that. And one thing though, however, there was an issue with this because in Massachusetts, child labor laws, they prohibited children under 18 to participate in selling any type of merchandise in public. So Prince was eventually charged and convicted of violating these child labor laws. So eventually, this case does get taken to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court decided is that although, parents and legal guardians, they were able to participate in religious activities, have their own religious beliefs, and even have their children and legal children or whoever their legal guardians who participate in religious activities, they can't put their children in danger. And since Prince had violated these child labor laws, state of Massachusetts believed that, and the Supreme Court believed that uh, they were putting children in danger. And the Supreme Court also decided that it was the government's responsibility to minimize these risks with children. So although they might not have been like the prime like or people in charge, like that's for the parents, they still have a broad responsibility with children. And the Supreme Court also decided, government, they have to minimize risk with these children and help protect children from the public and just any exploitation that might occur. So when it comes to Miss Frankie Dwyer Rowe, if her testimony is accurate, this does raise multiple concerns. Uh, so the government had, come, or the military came into her house, which is, government subsidiary. I'm so sorry, I cannot talk today. Um, and they had brought in a nightstick. They were beating their hands, saying, "You didn't see this. You didn't see any of this. Like you were not there. Like that piece of material, you didn't see this at all." And I mean, they were threatening physical violence, which, again, based on the precedents by Prince v. Massachusetts, the government is supposed to make sure they're supposed to minimize risk towards children. Uh, and obviously, threatening violence that's a big threat, and that's putting her in physical harm. And not only that, again, it's very ironic with this case because Prince v. Massachusetts that established that the government, they're supposed to protect children, like minimize risks towards them. And in this case, the government, again, they're threatening this child, like they're putting this child in danger. And although they might not have harmed her physically, there were definitely some emotional scars that had opened up in that video that Miss Dwyer Rowe, she was crying, she was very distressed in that video. And arguably that could be worse than a physical harm because again, this was decades after the initial crash in Roswell, and this did harm her, this traumatized her. And it's just very ironic that based on the precedents of Prince v. Massachusetts, this was that she was still traumatized. But some might argue that, again, Ms. Dwyer Rowe, she did have government secrets that the government didn't want her to leak. So maybe they were trying to protect her by doing that as well. But that's just another argument.
Thanks, Miguel. Yeah. Two polar opposites there, right? Within 3 years, 1944, 1947, you got these crazy activities. I'm going to turn to Nicole. And my question for you is, since Roswell and separate from U.S. Supreme Court decisions, are there any laws or treaties that deal with artifacts from space falling?
Yeah, so there's actually quite a few. A lot of them are related to the UN or the United Nations, which is a composite of treaties. There's several different treaties that address different aspects of spacecrafts potentially falling out of the sky and other things as well. So one of the main ones is the Outer Space Treaty, which was finalized in 1966, and it has many, many primary points. It's very long. But to give you all a brief explanation of what the treaty does is it identifies boundaries between what states, as in country governments, can do and how that interacts with other people. So, for example, they have general ones like the exploration and use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and interests of all countries and shall be the province of all mankind, right? Not specifically related to things falling out of the sky. But they also have regulations such as states shall be liable for damage caused by their space objects, and states shall avoid harmful contamination of space and the celestial bodies, meaning that if one country, country A, sends something up to orbit and it falls down onto country B's land, not only is country A responsible for coordinating with country B to make sure that they retrieve those materials, but they are also responsible for ensuring that if any damage was caused to property, citizens, or the land itself, that country A has to pay for that and has to compensate fairly whatever happened to country B. And so similarly, there's also a rule that countries cannot store nuclear bombs or missiles or heavy artillery in outer space, so that if it were to fall somewhere, A, if it was accidental, that wouldn't be good, and B, if it was intentional, you're violating UN policy and humanitarian and war-based law. Continuing on from that, the UN also had a Convention on International Liability for Damage Caused by State Objects, which once again just defines exactly what happens if a state object from one state lands on the domain of another state, including the damages, who interacts with those objects, and how the repairs or what is owed may be supplied to the country damaged. It also specifies that if two countries were to collaborate to build something, then they are both responsible. And if someone were to build a rocket in one country, that country is responsible, even if it's not official government property. So, for example, what we're seeing here in the United States, what NASA builds is government property. So, obviously, the US government is responsible. But dually, what SpaceX might build is also the responsibility of the United States government to either regulate and not allow to happen in the first place, or to ensure that any damages that are caused are therefore fixed in some way, shape, or form. And so that's one reason why countries have very, very different policies on private companies developing spacecrafts or other countries developing spacecrafts on their land, because these treaties demand that if that occurs, they take full and total responsibility. And so in the case of Roswell, even if this was a different weather balloon from somebody else, it would still be their responsibility at this time, even though the treaties didn't exist then. And so some other ones we also see, a really important one is the Bureau of Land Management is now responsible for things that happen similarly to Roswell. If there's an unidentified object on some land that's not manned, or there's a ranch hand who wants help identifying something, if there's no current danger, if there's no fire or some reason that a firefighter, police officer, or other public servant would need to be out there, then the Bureau of Land Management might assist, which is very, very different from what we saw in Roswell, which was a response conducted by the United States military themselves. And so there's definitely several different treaties and agreements that target artifacts falling from the sky, but they don't necessarily discuss UFOs in particular.
That's amazing. I knew none of that. So thank you.
I would hope by the time it hits you, it's hopefully identified. Hayden, as we conclude today's program, overall, as a pre-law student, what do you think are the most important lessons learned from Roswell?
And there are so many, but I'll try to keep it quick because it looks like we're running a little bit behind schedule. But there are obviously a lot of things. The takeaway from Roswell for most people is whether or not there are alien life. But I think there's something, if there is alien life and they were aliens crashing into Earth or into Roswell, New Mexico, evidently they seem to not have ill intentions for us, because we're all still having this conversation. But I think there's something much more concerning that is relevant about it, and especially from a legal aspect. And it's the power the government has to chill your rights. The power of the government has to almost take them away in a lot of cases, and the power, I think, also that the military can tend to have. All three of those things seem to be pretty relevant, and they seem to be relevant simultaneously, right? The first one that we see, and I'm going to relate it to Frankie Dwyer-Rowe, but this is true pretty much universally, is the government telling her that she can't talk. Not, well, she was never there, and that she has to keep this secret, otherwise bad things are going to happen, regardless of whether or not she was thrown in prison or something, or into a military prison or something worse. That's taking away her due process rights as well. She's losing her right to free speech, and then she's losing her right to a trial, and through all of these things that are critical to our Constitution. And this really, you can relate it to how the government, how much power the government truly has, and how important it is to be respectful of the rights that people are afforded. Because if we aren't respectful for them, there's very little that the government, and especially the military, the U.S. military was in 1947 and still is today the strongest military in the world. And if the military decided that it wanted to take away your rights, it would certainly be capable of doing so, right? There's very little opposition one can have to, there's a very little opposition that a 12-year-old girl can have to a military police officer with a baton. There's also very little opposition that the average person can have to the modern U.S. military if it were to decide that your rights were no longer important to it. So I think that those institutions and the prevalence of our right and the necessity to be vigilant in the protection of those rights is probably the most key issue to take away from the Roswell incident, even if it is a little bit more fun to talk about whether or not it was a UFO that landed in Roswell in 1947.
And I'm wondering too, like Miguel, overall, as a pre-law student, why do you think it's relevant for students in the year 2026 to study the Roswell case?
So I know we're running out of time, so I'll keep this as short as I can. But I think that it's not just important for pre-law students. I invite anyone to understand like why Roswell is so relevant in today's day and age in 2026. I remember when I was in high school, when my government class, I remember not my professor, my teacher, Mr. Gray, he made us carry around the pocket constitution like at all with us like at all times. He made us highlight our Bill of Rights and everything. And I remember thinking that none of this is gonna matter. Like, why do I need to know the Third Amendment? I'm not gonna have any Korean soldiers in my house or anything. Like, it seemed so silly to me at the time. But as I've grown up, and this is before I took the pre-law path, before I knew I wanted to go into law, I kind of thought that this wasn't going to be relevant, but the more I mature and everything, I know that now that like that Bill of Rights is one of the most important things that you will ever have in your life. You know, again, like going off what Caden was saying, that the government, they gave you these rights, but they still can violate them sometimes. During my time studying law, I've realized there's so many cases that we go over. I'd say at easy 100 plus 150 that we go through of the government violating cases or violating people's rights. And with Roswell, assuming that all these cases are true or testimonies are true and accurate, the government did seem to overstep their reach a little bit, especially with Miss Frankie Dwyer-Rowe. And I think that also in 2026, it's a different context than what Roswell was. Again, as I mentioned before, we have cameras in our pockets at all times with their phone. And I feel like we could, document cases like this more accurately. But again, you never know. So it's always just important to understand your rights, know that you have them. It's probably the most important thing that you'll ever be given, in my opinion.
I'm just going to jump in and say that since you were carrying around a pocket constitution, I think Suzanne wanted to applaud that. We have them here if anybody wants one. We give them out regularly.
Katie, it should be applauded. And if I could just say a final for 30 seconds, just put something out there. First of all, I want to thank everybody in attendance for taking the time to learn about the Roswell incident from a different angle. Obviously, it was a very different angle than what you might be used to. I really want to thank Katie and Suzanne and Karen and all the folks at the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs, the New Mexico State Library System, the New Mexico Museum of Space History for hosting this program, sponsoring this program, which I think shines a whole new light on Roswell to a large extent. But most importantly, I want to thank my students, Nicole, Caden, Tatiana and Miguel, who not only put so much effort into this in sharing their knowledge and their education, their experience with everyone, but doing so during the summer when school is out, and they are sitting here where they're not really in outer space, notwithstanding the virtual background behind them. They have other things going on in their summers and their future plans, but they were voluntarily willing to share their time and their expertise with us. So it makes me really happy, honestly, to be a professor at University of New Mexico, having the opportunity to work with students like Miguel and Tatiana and Nicole and Caden. So thank you to everyone for participating. I also want to indicate that today is actually the anniversary, June 24th, of the date in 1997 when the United States released a Project Mogul report about Roswell called Case Closed. Also next week is the 79th anniversary of the Roswell crash itself, July 2nd, 1947. So thank you all for attending, and thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you, Larry, for inviting us into this. We were really pleased to be a part of it. I learned a lot today. Thank you, guys.
Yes, thank you, Larry. Thank you so much.